Good morning and welcome back to another edition of History in Your Own Backyard. I'm Satoli and today I'm in Monroe, Michigan with Michael Roerick at St. Michael the Archangel Catholic Church. And Michael's going to tell us all about the history behind the church. So at the very beginning, what was the establishment of the church, or where would you like to start?
Well, French Catholic influence in this part of the country goes back as early as 1701 when Antoine de Cadillac, after the name of the car there, led French traders and a couple of priests to the shores of what is now the Detroit River in Detroit.
Okay.
And they founded the first church in the region, St. Anne.
Okay. So how long did the French control the region then?
Well, England challenged France for possession of what they called the New World, but by the middle of the 1700s, the French surrendered, and the British controlled all of what is now Canada and Michigan, and of course Monroe.
So tell me about, what did the early church look like when it first was established?
Well, there were a high percentage of Catholics here, but the church was hardly established by what we might consider standards today. In 1775, right before the Declaration of Independence, there were just 4 priests in this immense territory from the Great Lakes to the Mississippi, 2 in Detroit and 2 down in what was the mission back then of St. Louis.
What was the area that is now Monroe County? What was that like back then?
Well, although this area had long been frequented by natives, the Chippewas and Wyandots, Potawatomis, and others that were traveling the Saginaw Trail, which is now Dixie Highway, and the Great Sauk Trail, which is now US 12. Monroe County didn't have any permanent residents. Around 1785 or so, the first permanent resident, Francois Navarre, settled along the river, which was called the Numassupi, I think, the Sturgeon River, because there were so many sturgeon fish in the river.
Right.
And many French colonists followed after him because they were eager to escape the British autocratic rule in the Detroit area.
How did the first Catholic church ever come about?
Well, with the arrival of the settlers, efforts were made to establish a church in this river raisin hamlet, which was later called Monroe after the president. So in October of 1788, the bishop of pastor rather of St. Anne's met with about 50 settlers from Monroe to discuss the establishment of a parish. And soon thereafter, the settlers built a small chapel that included quarters for the priest. And Father Frechette was the first one that would come down here. Of course, he would only come once a year or thereabouts. And there was no permanent priest in Monroe until about 1794 when Father Edmund Burke arrived on scene.
Okay.
They chose St. Antoine de Padua, St. Anthony, as the patron saint of the new parish. And I got to tell you that Father Burke was no fan of being here. He wrote that, "I'm here in the midst of heathens. This is the last and most distant parish inhabited by Catholics on this earth."
Wow. So whatever became of Father Burke?
Well, after the Declaration of Independence, the English didn't give up hopes of regaining her colonies. And there was a lot of tension, of course, which eventually led to the War of 1812. Father Burke was a British loyalist, and he found himself on the wrong side of a shifting national boundary. And Burke himself wrote that he was living among brigands 1,000 times worse than the savages. He said, "It's evident I can't remain in a post subject to the Yankees. I don't like them, and they don't like me." So he left for British friendlier Canada in late May of 1796.
Wow. What happened here during the War of 1812? Tell us about that.
Well, there were significant battles in this Second War for Independence fought nearby. Key among them, of course, was the Battle of Frenchtown on January 22nd of 1813, and somewhat more importantly, the massacre of American troops that took place the following day. Both of those were just a few hundred yards from where we're sitting right now. Remember the Raisin became the rallying cry for American troops until the war's end. Peace negotiations went on, and at one point, by the way, the British had proposed that the River Raisin was actually the national boundary between Canada and the United States. That obviously didn't work, but had it worked, St. Michael would have been within a stone's throw of the international boundary.
And the River Raisin battlefield is just right across the river, right?
The River Raisin battlefield, the Frenchtown battlefield, is on the other side of the river, correct, the north side of the river, and downstream about a quarter of a mile, something like that.
Okay. Yeah. Was the church expanding in the years before the War of 1812?
It was. Michigan, up to that point, had been under the authority of the Bishop of Quebec, and then they established a diocese in Baltimore. But by the early 1800s, the American population was on the rise, and Rome decided that there was a need for a new diocese. So they created four: Boston, Philadelphia, New York, all of which make sense to us now, and Bardstown, Kentucky. Somewhat unlikely in retrospect, but all of Kentucky and Tennessee and Ohio and Michigan, of course, including Monroe, became part of the Diocese of Bardstown, Kentucky.
Okay. How many Catholics were in Michigan after the War of 1812?
Well, in 1822, there was a survey by the famous Father Gabriel Richard, who showed at least 7,000 Catholics in Michigan. But the opening of the Erie Canal just a couple of years later in 1825 encouraged widespread migration to Michigan because the entire journey from Europe and beyond could be undertaken by water. So by 1833, the population was such that Rome created the Diocese of Detroit as well, and then Monroe, of course, became part of the Diocese of Detroit.
Okay. Tell me what priests were ministering to the people of Monroe.
Well, there was one. The Bishop of Detroit had persuaded a friend of his, Father Louis Gillet, I believe is how you pronounce it. He was a Redemptorist from France, to do missionary work with the French-speaking people of Michigan. And he arrived in Monroe in late June of 1844.
So just curious, were there any Catholic schools in this area?
There was one in Detroit, and really only because of a lack of suitable teachers. So once Father Gillet arrived on scene, he was instrumental in helping to found the Sisters Servants of the Immaculate Heart of Mary, the IHM Sisters, which was the first community to be established in the new diocese. And the IHM Sisters played a huge role in developing Catholic education in this region.
And they're also right across the river, correct?
The IHM Mother House is just across the river, 150, 200 yards away.
Right. So with a parish already in Monroe, was it necessary to start another parish?
Well, actually by 1900, there'd be actually 4 Catholic parishes in downtown Monroe, all within just a few blocks of one another. In those days, churches were classified as based on language or on territory. In other words, were they along ethnic lines or geographic lines? And all 4 of the downtown Monroe parishes were formed along language or ethnic lines. It's St. Antoine, or now St. Mary, for the French-speaking people, St. Michael for the German-speaking people, St. John the Baptist for the Irish, and St. Joseph for the Italians. By late 1845, the German-speaking Catholic population was on the rise, and Father Gillet summoned a fellow Redemptorist by the name of Simon Sanderl to Monroe. He was a 31-year-old German-speaking native of Austria, and he began ministering to the German faithful of Monroe. And so 1845 marks the unofficial launch of the second parish in Monroe. That would be St. Michael the Archangel, of course.
Okay.
Though it'd still be a few more years before the German Catholics would have a church of their own.
How long did the German immigrants actually have to wait until they had a parish of their own then?
It was about 5 years. By mid-century, a group of influential men purchased a building, which was actually the home of the first mayor of Monroe, Colonel George Harleston, who had recently died. And by the way, the building that was to become a Catholic church had not only been used as a home, but it was a stagecoach inn, a tavern, a bank, and had even been the site of the 1849 county fair. So they bought the home in July of 1852 for $2,000, and the ground floor was converted to a church. The top floor had 6 rooms. 4 of them were converted to a rectory. 2 were used as a school. The church was dedicated on September 29th of 1852. That's the feast of St. Michael the Archangel. And that marked the official establishment of the parish.
And is that home still standing today?
No, that home was raised quite a number of years ago, long before I arrived in Monroe, I'm afraid.
Okay. And what about the school? Tell me about that.
At that point, there were 80 to 90 students in the German school, as it was known back then. The first teachers were lay people, but 3 years in, 1855, Sister Aloysius Walter of the new IHM Sisters arrived on scene to teach, and she eventually became principal, by the way. And that marked the first time that the IHMs received pay for any of their work in teaching, and they got a whopping $6 a month.
Did St. Michael ever have any homegrown priest?
They have. The first one was Benjamin Schmidtdeal. He was ordained in 1863, and 5 days later, he reported to St. Michael the Archangel, where he served the faithful in his first and only assignment for the next 36 years. He was the longest serving pastor of St. Michael.
What was the state of the parish when Father Schmidtdeal arrived?
Well, the school was suffering from some financial difficulties, and the growing congregation, of course, was still confined to the renovated Harleston House as a church. So he pressed for a new church when he arrived, and in 1865, the parishioners purchased some adjoining property. The cornerstone was laid in June of 1866, and off they went.
And that's this building that we're in today?
That's this building.
Okay. How long did it take to build the church?
Well, remarkably, it took a mere 15 months to build this church. It's a brick build in the Gothic style. It's approximately 60 feet wide by 145 feet long. The walls are 40 feet high, and the ceiling height 52 feet. It was temporarily, by the way, finished without a spire that was added later. And the cost of the church at that time was just $40,000.
So if it was only $40,000, who even covered that amount?
I'm sure there was a lot of money back in those days, but the parishioners, of course, provided most of the funds for the building of the church, along with labor themselves. One of the best stories about that is from a fellow, Mr. Schnur. I'm afraid I don't know his first name, but he was a devout Catholic and a master metal worker, but a man of modest wealth. And his contribution was in time and talent. Using brass furnished by a fellow by the name of Mr. Steiner, his employer, Mr. Schnur worked day and night burning the midnight oil, I'm sure literally and figuratively, building his contribution, which was the sacristy lamp. Word spread about his efforts, and people would stop by his house to see his progress and admire his skill set. And when he was done, he proudly presented his gift to the parish, and it's the beautiful sacristy lamp that is suspended over the altar, and it's still there 171 years later.
Tell me, when was the church dedicated then?
Well, the New German Catholic Church, as the newspaper The Monroe Commercial described it, was dedicated on October the 2nd of 1867. There were 25 priests here and 1,500 parishioners and visitors on hand.
Tell me, were there any unusual design features?
By today's standards, yes. There were several design elements that were uniquely 19th century. For example, the pulpit, which is now on the altar, was on the east wall, elevated up about 8 feet or so between the second and third windows. The only artificial lighting in the church was a couple of candle lamps that were suspended from the ceiling over the communion rail. And instead of pews throughout the church, the first 4 pews were actually just benches. Not sure why. But of course, those design elements are gone now. They've been modernized and replaced.
Right. Where did the pastor live at the very beginning here?
Well, once the new church was built, the main floor of the house was converted into school purposes, and the parishioners decided it was time to turn their attention to building a proper residence for the pastor. So in 1873, they built a beautiful 2,800 square foot house immediately east of the church, still there these days. And by the way, that was for a mere $5,000.
So back to the steeple. When was that eventually added?
The work was completed in 1883, in July of 1883. The top of the spire has a cross, which is 6.5 feet by 4.5 feet, and it stands 186 feet above the ground. For a long time, maybe even still today, it was the tallest man-made object in the county. Just to give you an idea of the scope of this project, by the way, the spire contains approximately 5 linear miles of lumber, 2,000 pounds of bolts and nails and such, 7,000 bricks, 45 tons of stone, including 8 pieces that are 4,000 pounds each. And the conical spire roof has 16,000 shingles. A very large undertaking.
Isn't that amazing what they built back then?
Without the kind of power equipment and lifts that we have today. Yeah.
So tell me about the bells in the steeple. Are there bells in the steeple?
Right, what's a steeple without bells? So an order was placed with the St. Louis Bell Foundry for 3 bells, and they arrived at the church in January of 1885. They are 4,000 pounds, 2,000 pounds, and 1,000 pounds respectively. They sound the notes of C, E, and G. And they were installed and rang out over Monroe on January 15th of 1885, which coincidentally is almost exactly 72 years after that Battle of Frenchtown across the river.
And how often do they ring today?
Well, they don't ring much anymore. There's some structural issues that we noticed some time ago, and so sadly at the moment anyway, they don't ring out.
Okay. What other additions to the church would you like to talk about?
Well, I'd say the most notable enhancement were the magnificent altars that were added in 1889. They were made of oak and imported from Germany. Look at the size of them, by boat through New York City. The main altar is by far the largest of the 5. It replaced a much smaller and less ornate altar that had been in the church since 1867 or thereabouts. It's almost 50 feet high. It reaches beyond the heart of the beautiful rose-colored window, which is in the center of the apse. Well, technically, the rose-colored window is not in the center of the apse. If you notice, it's rather decidedly to the left of the center. I'm not sure why, but it's one of the idiosyncrasies, I think, that makes the building so wonderful. The main element of the altar is the large crucifix in the center with several figures at the base of the cross. And there's several other medium and small statues placed on the altar. And by the way, those statues are not fixed in place. And I know that because thankfully no one was hurt, but in the mid-1900s, one of them came crashing down in the middle of Mass. So,
really?
Yeah. You also can't miss the beautiful high relief of the Last Supper that's immediately below the altar. The side altars on the south-facing walls feature the statues of Mary and Joseph, respectively. All these altars are highly ornate and gilded. And it's hard to imagine how they were imported from Europe. It's also hard to imagine such craftsmanship these days. But now there were 2 other altars, a total of 5. That were small, but they were between the main altar and the sacristy doors, but they've since been removed from the church.
And did you say everything was built in Europe and then shipped over?
Built in Europe and shipped over. I can't imagine how many pieces they were in when they were shipped. I'm sure they weren't the size that they are now. Okay. But yeah, it's quite a feat just getting them from Europe to here.
Right. Tell me about the Stations of the Cross. They're beautiful.
Right. They were added to the church in the summer of 1923, so 100 years ago, and partly to deal with the damage that had been caused by a fire earlier that year. The parish was in the process of restoring and redecorating the interior of the church, which at that point was 56 years old. Until that time, the stations were simple paintings that were suspended from the walls at a slight angle, but again, they'd been damaged in the fire as well. So the parish reached out to the Tyrolese Art Company, also in Germany, and they built these incredible three-dimensional stations that are sculpted entirely of wood, and then, of course, beautifully hand-painted. And they were imported and installed in the church, and they remain here today as just gorgeous works of art.
Back to the fire, how did that happen and how much damage? Do you know?
It's unclear exactly how the fire started, but the interior of the church was heavily damaged by smoke, not necessarily fire. The fire was in the basement of the church,
Okay.
and fortunately it was extinguished before it really caught hold, because that obviously could have destroyed the church completely.
Right.